is Hispaniola. In 1492, Christopher Columbus landed on the island. He was known to discover it, but he really didn't. Natives called Tainos had been living on the island for hundreds of years before any explorers came. Many were enslaved. A lot died from forced labor, hunger, disease, and mass killings. Over 60,000 natives died. For the next few centuries, Spain and France fought for control over the island. The island was known to be a haven for pirates. Eventually, the island was split into two. The French side later became Haiti, and the other half was ruled by Spain, which later became the Dominican Republic. There were slave rebellions starting in 1791 that later led to Haiti becoming a free country. Eventually, Haiti controlled the entire island. In 1844, the Dominican Republic declared its independence from Haiti. In 1916, America invaded the Dominican Republic because they owed America money. A man named Rafael Trujillo enlisted in the National Guard. He quickly rose to power and became Brigadier General and Commander-in-Chief of the Dominican Republic's army. In 1930, Trujillo and his followers overthrew the government. On May 16, 1930, Trujillo was chosen to be president without opposition. A year after he became president, he organized the Partido Dominicano, or the Dominican Party, which controlled the Dominican politics for the next 3 decades. During that time, Trujillo was an unconditional, brutal dictator. After a hurricane wrecked much of the Dominican Republic, Trujillo helped rebuild the country by renaming towns, streets, even the country's capital after himself. He held celebrations, parades, and holidays, all celebrating himself. Trujillo used his political power to acquire great personal wealth. In 1937, Trujillo made agreements with the Haitian president to let Haitians over the border. But Trujillo changed his mind and wanted complete control over the border. In October 1937, Trujillo ordered the expulsion of thousands of Haitians living on the border of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. It was decided that if a person could not pronounce the letter R in perejil, the Spanish word for parsley, because R is difficult for Haitians to pronounce, they would be killed. This led to the Parsley Massacre. His rule over his own people also included many human rights violations. This is my great-great-grandmother. Her name is Rosa Escria Campillo, but they called her Chelita because she was part Sicilian. She lived in the Dominican Republic in the Trujillo era. On the top of this picture, it says Our High Society, meaning she was a wealthy citizen. She had twins, a boy and a girl, Jose Oscar, known as Colleen, and Maria Estela. My great-grandmother married a Dominican soldier and helped run a school with her mother. Her brother, my great-granduncle, joined the United States Army and fought in France and Germany. On the back of this picture, it says he was standing on top of Hitler's bomb bunker. When he came back from World War II, he realized that he returned to a country that had the same type of fascist dictator that he had just come back from fighting against. After World War II, many governments were opposed to Trujillo's brutal rule, including Venezuela, Guatemala, Cuba, and Haiti. At the same time, in Cuba, a group led by a bunch of intellectuals, including a man named Juan Bosch, wrote a manifesto calling for the liberation of the Dominican Republic. They called on regional governments to help them militarily. They were supplied $25,000 from Haiti and Venezuela for the fight. A rich farmer by the name of Juan Rodriguez gave them $100,000. The group set up their headquarters in a hotel in Havana, called themselves the Caribbean League, and recruited an army made up of mostly Dominicans and Cubans, but included men from other countries. Many were veterans of the Spanish Civil War and World War II. Among the group were Raul and Fidel Castro. At the time, Fidel Castro was a student just beginning his revolutionary activities. Also in the group was my granduncle, Jose Oscar, who was an officer in this army. This army trained on a small treeless island off of Cuba called Cayo Confites. There was difficult living conditions. The leaders set about procuring arms. Since it was after World War II, a lot of arms were available. They got several ships and planes from the United States and some from Cuba. Eventually, the Dominican government learned of the group. They began to protest to the U.S. and Cuban governments. Trujillo said that as soon as a soldier sets foot on the Dominican land, he would declare war on Cuba. As our invasion day approached, the Dominican Republic continued to complain to the U.S. and Cuban governments. The United States recalled their 3 pilots and planes back to the United States. Other planes had been seized. Finally, the expedition set sail, although there was much confusion among the troops, especially concerning the amount of arms. As the ship set sail, they were stopped and were arrested by the Cuban government, except for Fidel Castro, who jumped off the ship with some friends. The soldiers were all imprisoned in Cuba, but were eventually freed when Juan Bosch went on a hunger strike. In the U.S. State Department document summarizing the Cayo Confites incident, U.S. Ambassador R. Henry Norweb, who was involved with the negotiations between the governments of the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and the United States, concludes in his document with, "For the threat of a revolution or invasion of the Dominican Republic is not dead. So long as Trujillo continues to be president, exiles will fan the flame of hope. It will not be so easy again. The impresarios are still on stage. Their curtain may yet rise on a hit show." After the failure of the Cayo Confites, many of the major players went into exile, including my uncle, who returned to New York. This is my uncle's business card. It says he was a commissioner of the Dominican Revolutionary Party. Trujillo began negotiating a pardon with conspirators. Negotiations were led by Felix Bernardino, who was known to be one of Trujillo's main henchmen. It took 2 years for the members of the Caribbean League to agree to be pardoned. In my house, we have a bookcase filled with books and items from my uncle. Among them is this booklet about Trujillo pardoning the Caribbean League. The book is mostly propaganda for Trujillo, where he wants to show how wonderful he was. My uncle is pictured on the cover, along with Raul Castro and the rest of the people Trujillo pardoned. Pictured in the book is a group of people, including my uncle, receiving a gold pin signifying the pardon. In the book, it shows a group leaving New York, arriving in Santo Domingo, being taken out to nightclubs, swimming pools, visiting different cities, and it eventually shows them leaving to go back to New York. So what happened as a result of the Cayo Confites expedition? Trujillo was eventually assassinated about a decade later. It was a turning point for the people of the Dominican Republic, who were finally freed from Trujillo's oppressive rule. Fidel Castro went on to overthrow the Cuban government and ruled Cuba with an iron fist for the next 50 years before turning the government over to his brother Raul, another member of the Cayo Confites group. Fidel later said of his experience at the Cayo Confites that he learned what not to do. He realized you could not overthrow a government with the kind of army organized for the Cayo Confites attempt. You could not attack a strong army head-on. He realized he would need to use guerrilla tactics. Castro's successful overthrow of the Cuban government was one of the earliest battles of the Cold War. As for my uncle, little is known in my family about his activities. He was married and had 3 children whom he would abandon. He lived in New York, often staying with my great-grandmother's family. We know little of what kind of work he did. Although we know he spent time as a hypnotist, we know he was interviewed by the CIA where he claimed diplomatic immunity. And after Trujillo was killed, he worked for some time in the Dominican government as an ambassador to Mexico. Eventually, he moved to Spain, where he spent some time working for the Spanish government, eventually retiring in the south of Spain. Sometime during the negotiations for the pardon of the Cayo Confites conspirators, my great-grandmother was granted a divorce from her husband in the army, my great-grandfather. This picture is of my great-great-grandmother, my great-grandmother, and my grandmother after they had all arrived in New York. Without the events of the Cayo Confites, these 3 women may have never immigrated to New York, where my mother might never have met my Irish father. This is a picture of my great-granduncle, my mother, and I. It was the only time I had met him. I was 1 year old, and he had come back to New York for the first time in about 30 years to visit the family he had abandoned about 40 years before. Although I don't know a lot about my uncle, I know he worked hard to change the lives of the people of his country.